In the summer of 1845, two ships sailed out of the Thames, bound for the top of the world. They carried 129 men, tons of preserved food, a library of over 1,000 books, and the confidence of the most powerful navy on Earth. They were going to find the Northwest Passage, the sea route through the Canadian Arctic that had lured explorers for 3 centuries. Not one of them came home. What happened to Sir John Franklin's expedition became one of the 19th century's deepest mysteries. For over 160 years, searchers found scattered bones, cairns, a handful of written records, and almost nothing else. Only in the last decade have the ships themselves been found, resting on the seafloor, silent and largely intact. And still, the full story of how a state-of-the-art expedition ended in mass death remains only partly answered. This is the story of what we know, what we found, and what still refuses to be explained. By the 1840s, Britain had spent generations searching for the Northwest Passage. Mapping the Arctic had become a matter of national prestige, scientific ambition, and imperial pride. The Royal Navy had the ships, the money, and after the Napoleonic Wars, a surplus of experienced officers eager for a mission. Sir John Franklin was 59 years old when he was given command. He was a respected officer with 2 previous Arctic expeditions behind him, one of which had ended in near starvation and cannibalism among his men, a fact the Admiralty knew and, evidently, did not consider disqualifying. His ships were HMS Erebus and HMS Terror, both former warships reinforced for ice. They were outfitted with steam engines connected to locomotive propellers, a novelty for polar exploration. They carried enough food, tinned and preserved, to last 3 years. They had libraries, hand organs, and officers who kept detailed journals. By the standards of the day, this was not a reckless gamble. It was Britain's best attempt at solving a problem that had defeated explorers since the days of Martin Frobisher. The ships departed England in May of 1845. They were last seen by European whalers in Baffin Bay in July, waiting to cross into Lancaster Sound. After that, for the outside world, they simply disappeared. 2 winters passed with no word. This was not unusual for Arctic voyages, which could take years. But by 1848, concern had turned to alarm. The Admiralty, pressed by Franklin's wife, Lady Jane Franklin, and by public pressure, began sending search expeditions. Over the next decade, more than 30 missions from Britain and the United States combed the Arctic for traces of the lost crews. It became the largest search and rescue operation of the 19th century, and it mapped more of the Canadian Arctic than the original expedition ever would have. The first hard evidence came in 1850. Search parties found graves on Beechey Island, where the expedition had wintered in 1845 and 46. 3 sailors, John Torrington, John Hartnell, and William Brain, had died there and been buried with formal headstones. Their deaths, before the expedition had even truly begun its search for the passage, were an early sign that something aboard those ships was already wrong. The most important discovery came in 1859, when explorer Francis Leopold McClintock's search party found a single written record on King William Island, tucked into a cairn. It's known simply as the Victory Point Note, and it is the only substantial written account of the expedition's fate that has ever been recovered. The note was written on a standard Admiralty form, filled in twice a year apart by two different hands. The first entry, dated May of 1847, was almost cheerfully routine. It reported that the ships had wintered near King William Island and that all well. Sir John Franklin was named as commanding. The second entry, squeezed into the margins and dated April of 1848, told a different story entirely. Franklin was dead as of June 11, 1847. 9 officers and 15 men had also died. The ships had been abandoned in the ice, and the surviving crew, 105 men, were marching south toward the Back River, hoping to reach mainland Canada and, eventually, help. They never made it. Along the way, searchers found other traces: a lifeboat containing 2 skeletons and an extraordinary, almost bewildering assortment of items, including silver cutlery, a chronometer, and books, but curiously little food. Inuit oral testimony, gathered by explorer Charles Francis Hall and others in the 1860s, described encounters with a group of starving white men dragging a boat, and later, the discovery of bodies, some showing signs of what the Inuit described plainly as cannibalism. For over a century, that was essentially the entire record. Scattered bones, a note, second-hand testimony that Victorian society largely refused to believe because it did not want to believe that British naval officers had eaten their own dead. Modern science has since confirmed it. Analysis of human bones recovered from King William Island in the 1990s and 2000s revealed cut marks consistent with defleshing, the kind of marks left when someone strips meat from bone with a knife. It was not proof of murder. It was evidence of desperation, of men trying to survive long after any real hope of rescue had passed. So the broad outline of the tragedy has long been known. The ships got trapped in ice, Franklin died, the survivors abandoned the vessels and tried to walk to safety, and virtually all of them perished along the way. But the deeper question, the one that has occupied historians and scientists for over a century, is why? Why did a well-supplied, well-led expedition fall apart so completely? Several theories have been proposed, and the evidence suggests it wasn't one single cause, but a convergence of several. The first is the ice itself. Tree ring and ice core data show that the mid-1840s fell during a period of unusually severe Arctic conditions. The ships became icebound near King William Island in September of 1846 and never broke free. Modern oceanographers studying the region's currents have noted that the ice there behaves unpredictably, sometimes trapping ships for years at a stretch. This was, in a sense, simple bad luck compounded by geography. The second theory concerns the expedition's food supply. The ships carried over 8,000 tins of preserved food, supplied by a contractor named Stephen Goldner, who had won the contract on short notice and rushed the order. Examination of surviving tins in the 20th century found some had been sealed carelessly, with solder seams that could have allowed contamination. Some historians and scientists have proposed that spoiled or poorly canned food contributed to illness among the crew, though this remains debated rather than proven. The third theory, and one of the more famous, is lead poisoning. Some of those tins were sealed with lead solder, and elevated lead levels have been found in bones and preserved remains from Franklin crew members, including the men buried on Beechey Island. For years, this was presented as a leading explanation for cognitive decline and health failure among the crew. More recent research has complicated this picture. Lead levels in 1840s Britain were high across the general population, from pewter dishware to water pipes, So scientists remain divided on how much the tinned food specifically worsened an already elevated baseline, and how much lead exposure actually impaired the men's judgment or physical condition during the expedition itself. A fourth and increasingly discussed factor is scurvy, tuberculosis, and other diseases likely made worse by cold, exhaustion, and inadequate nutrition over the long, dark Arctic winters. Analysis of the Beechey Island bodies found signs consistent with tuberculosis and possibly other chronic conditions. Malnutrition would have weakened the men's immune systems long before starvation became the direct cause of death for those who marched south. And then there is the decision-making itself. Harder to reconstruct, but crucial. Franklin's crew, after abandoning the ships, chose to march overland toward the Back River rather than retreat the way they'd come or wait longer for rescue. Whether this was a reasoned decision based on the best information available or a desperate gamble born of dwindling options is something the written record simply doesn't tell us. The note found at Victory Point gives dates and names, but almost nothing about why the officers chose the path they did. The most dramatic developments in this story came remarkably recently. In 2014, a Canadian search team, guided in part by Inuit oral tradition that had described the wreck's location for generations, found HMS Erebus in Queen Maud Gulf. 2 years later, in 2016, HMS Terror was found as well, in a bay whose name, ironically, had been suggested by Inuit testimony collected decades earlier and largely dismissed at the time. Both wrecks were found in far better condition than expected, sitting upright on the seafloor, timbers intact, personal items still in place. Divers have since recovered plates, boots, and even the captain's cabin at Terror was found remarkably preserved, with drawers still closed and shelves still holding their contents. It was, by any measure, an extraordinary discovery, one that vindicated Inuit knowledge that had been ignored by European searchers for over a century. And yet the wrecks have not delivered the final answer many hoped for. No captain's log has been recovered. No comprehensive written account of the expedition's final years has surfaced. The ships tell us how the crew lived, in fragments, but not, in any complete sense, how or why the expedition truly failed. So the story stands today, somewhere between solved and unsolved. We know the ships got trapped in ice. We know men died, first slowly aboard the vessels, then rapidly during the retreat. We know cannibalism occurred among at least some of the survivors, confirmed by both Inuit testimony and forensic evidence on the bones. We know contamination, illness, and malnutrition all likely played some role. What we don't know, and may never know, is the full sequence of decisions, misfortunes, and failures that turned a state-of-the-art expedition into a mass grave scattered across 200 miles of Arctic tundra. We don't know exactly how each man died, or in what order, or what was said in those final days as hope ran out. The Victory Point note tells us the beginning of the end. It does not tell us the end itself. The Arctic keeps its records differently than we do. Ice preserves. Cold slows decay. And yet the full truth of the Franklin expedition has resisted recovery for over a century and a half, hidden not by malice or conspiracy, but by the sheer, indifferent vastness of the place where it happened. 2 ships have been found. A note has been read. Bones have been studied by forensic scientists using tools Franklin's contemporaries could not have imagined. And still, somewhere in that white, frozen expanse, the full story of 129 men remains exactly what it has always been, mostly unknown. If you found this story as haunting as we did, subscribe to The True Unknown for more real mysteries pulled from the historical record.